Hi, this is Greg Smythe, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. The goal of the podcast is to share stories of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things, both at home in the province and around the world. This week's guest is Tim Powers, who has worked behind the scenes in provincial and federal politics for many decades. Tim is also a regular host or guest on both CBC and VOCM networks. During the episode, we discuss how growing up in Newfoundland shaped him. We talk about Canada's approach to climate change, as well as how COVID-19 will permanently change the political landscape. We also have a very open discussion about mental health. I genuinely enjoyed this conversation with Tim and appreciated his open and honest dialogue. I hope you enjoy listening to the episode and look forward to sharing more stories like this in the near future. So thanks, first of all, for joining Tim today, and nice to meet you. I think, as I mentioned before we started recording, I just wanted to give you some context on what GlobalNL is and what we're trying to accomplish. So it's something that started really organically about 3 or 4 years ago in 2017. I met a friend of mine, Kingsley Gifford, in Toronto, and we were both really doing kind of two separate efforts. I was mostly like kind of focused on helping students connect to different opportunities. I was in Silicon Valley at the time and trying to help kind of engineering students get work terms, because at the time it was very difficult to find them. And he was doing something similar in Toronto. And so we kind of joined forces together and formalized it. Since then, it's kind of grown, grassroots up a little bit, but the broader mission is to connect and empower people of the province, both at home and abroad. And I think, I've heard these stats that there's more Newfoundlanders living abroad than there is at home. And I think trying to harness that power of that community to support each other and to support the province is one that's worth exploring. And so we've been doing that for about 3 years and had a lot of big and small success. This podcast is also just a part of kind of sharing stories,
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for people there's lots of famous Newfoundlanders, which are great to hear stories of, but there's lots of smaller ones that don't really get amplified. And it's been really inspiring for me, and then to share some of those stories with others as well. And so we're also hoping to kind of take it to the next level too. We just incorporated, and we'll probably go through an effort to fundraise and maybe hire. We've been able to partner with the university to have some students work for us, which has been a big help. And then may try and hire some full-time or, one full-time person later in the year, so we can kind of expand outside of some of the initial scope we have. So that's it. Any comments or questions on that?
That's great, Greg. Geez, the technology and advanced learning is much better than what we used to do in the old days. We just used to try to hire Newfoundlanders and pick up the phone to do it. But now you can have podcasts, you can get them on Insta, TikTok, whatever way. But the job is the same, to help our people wherever they are. So good on you all for doing that. That's wonderful.
Well, our unofficial mission is if we don't go to bat for each other, kind of who will? I think.
Yeah,
and I think that's some inspiration, whether it's perverse or not, for me, is like seeing and being in the U.S. for about 8 years. You see the power of the how strong their alumni associations are for the university. And that's very powerful. But if you're not a part of one of those, you can kind of be excluded from some opportunity. And so, that's why we partnered up with the university at home to be able to do that, because you see the benefits of having a strong community like that.
Listen, the Newfoundland Labrador alumni is stronger than any Harvard or Princeton or Yale. It's just more diverse. That's all.
Exactly. So that's that. So why don't we jump into some of your background? How do you think growing up in Newfoundland shaped you? And I guess for the guest context, my understanding is you've lived in Ottawa for a long time, but I imagine you spend a fair amount of time back and forth to the province. But maybe give us context there.
Sure. I get. God, I don't want to say. I've lived in Ottawa now. This is the second time I've lived in Ottawa. I've been here, I guess, since the late 1999 is when I came back to Ottawa again. So I've been here 22 years. This go round. But other than the frigging pandemic, which is the longest I've ever been away from home, now going on 13 months, soon 14, God forbid. I'm usually home once or twice a month anyway, because of work and family. But I've been living here for quite a while. But home is still Newfoundland and Labrador, and always will be for me. And I'm not just saying it, it's the reality. If you were to come into my home, you would be surrounded by things that would be very familiar to you. The only thing that's maybe missing is some Black Horse and Jockey Club, but my beer choices have evolved with age.
That's another theme I see. Like when I meet Newfoundland expats kind of living abroad, like everyone's got their kind of Newfoundland shrines spread throughout the home. We even a guy, Rob Kosh here that works for Apple. We went to his house and he had his like university yearbook, and he even had his like Mon engineering jacket from 30 years ago. He kind of got it out of the closet. So anyways, it's great to see. So how do you think growing up in Newfoundland shaped you?
Oh yeah, that was the original question. How hasn't it shaped me is the way I would reframe that. I mean, look, I was very lucky, like probably you were, many people listening to the podcast, to grow up in a very boisterous, generous, broad family environment, a welcoming environment. I mean, Newfoundland, we may be very homogeneously white and not appear to be diverse, but I think from an ethnic background and diversity of different people from different countries, but I think in thought and in deed and in intellectual encouragement, we had all of that diversity. Certainly I did. And, the desire to learn was instilled in me in Newfoundland. The desire to travel and give back to Newfoundland was instilled in me when I grew up at home. But the desire always to be grounded in Newfoundland and Labrador, wherever you live, was part and parcel of it. And I attribute that to my home environment and I hope humility. The one thing you're certainly taught at home, or I was taught at home, never get too big for your britches. And I said this to someone else. The best advice my mother ever gave me when I first moved to Ottawa, I came to Ottawa as a young guy to work for John Crosby. And she said, it doesn't matter whether you're Brian Mulrooney or you're whomever, everybody puts their pants on one leg at a time. And that's still the best advice I think I've been given by anybody.
Yeah. Because there's two sides of that coin I've experienced anyways, that it can be intimidating, as you go, like moving to the mainland, we'll say, for lack of a better term, or when I moved to the US, there is like an underdog mentality we have. And I think it's probably driven me in a strong way, and it took me years to almost say get over the fact that I was smart enough to compete with people from the mainland or from the US that went to fancy name schools and things like that. And it took me a long time to realize that I was, smart enough and could work hard enough to do that. And, but anyways, I also think that the healthy part of the humility, I think too, is a good balancing effect of that.
Well, you're good point too. Look, I think part of our history of growing up is to assume we've been screwed over by everybody else under the sun, right? Newfoundlanders never did anything bad with Churchill Falls. That was Quebec. We didn't do a bad deal. We've been screwed over here and screwed over there, and so we use that mentality to fight back and drive us. Hey, myths are powerful things.
I think that's why Danny Williams was so popular. He was good at picking a fight and always being the underdog, or at least that was the way the story went.
That's exactly right, and it's worked for lots of political and business leaders for sure.
Exactly. I guess this is kind of your realm, I guess. I don't know if this is a bad word or not, but what would you describe yourself as, and is the term lobbyist appropriate or not?
We got into conversation. I don't mind the word. In America, if somebody were using it, they would think we're bottom feeding scumbags. I'm slightly evolved above that, maybe not much, but yeah, lobbyist is fine. Look, one of the businesses that I own is in government relations. See, there's a nicer term, Greg, that we prefer, and we lobby governments and others for undertakings. So yeah, that's part of what I do. It's not all of what I do, but it's another skill, right? When you come from Newfoundland, you know how to ask for things and you know how to make the case for things. So it kind of was. I guess so. Like, to be curious,
I know there's kind of some tongue in cheek around and there's some connotations around the word, but what does it mean to you, I guess? Or where do you think your role or your firms, like, where do you guys add value, or what do you think, where do you think your secret sauce is?
Well, let me give you the legitimate definition of it. And
Yeah.
lobbying actually comes from the days in the old Westminster Parliament in the UK when people were in the lobby of Parliament talking to parliamentarians about things that were important to them.
I
As
didn't
for,
know that. That's interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't pull that one out of my butt. That is generally true from what I know too. But it lobby starts from an actual physical structure where people met and
Yeah.
engaged. And I don't know, secret sauce. I think what we're good at is understanding the environment, understanding where somebody's coming from, and how you bring those two things together and develop a strategic plan to get people what they want. There's not a lot of difference between what we do and what management consultants do. We diagnose your challenge and we come up with, we also provide you the antidote, if we can, to get where you need to go to recover, to heal, to grow, whatever it may be.
Do you think, like, I see communications is like the word that gets used a lot in your website, at least? Why do you think communications is, there's kind of the substance underneath it, the policies, like the actual mechanics of things that are happening. But do you think the way it's communicated is so important to like actually getting things done?
It's all about storytelling, right? Again, another
Yeah.
thing we learned in Newfoundland, and that's one of the things I still love so much about home. I think we still remain some of the best oral storytellers in the country. Only, you're talking about big name Newfoundlanders, the Britches, the Mercers, Tom Power. All of those people are great storytellers, right?
Yeah.
And you have to tell a story for people to act. That's what communications really is about. It won't shock you living in Ontario as well that we still like to make fun of Ontarians for being rather bland and boring at doing it. So having a little bit of silver tongue spliced with a little bit of BS every now and then and applied by a golden shovel is never a bad thing if you can make a buck off of it.
Yeah. I mean, storytelling, I guess the more I've learned about it is like, it's more like, it is such a core human thing. Like, it's how
Yeah.
we operate. Like, and I kind of thought I won't say this like, I don't know, like kind of abstract concept, but I read the book Sapiens a
Mm-hmm.
couple of years ago, and like he really described like like stories are almost at the core of why humans have been so successful as a species. And like money and corporations and governments are all just like stories we tell each other. And the only reason they exist is because we all believe in the same stories. They're not really physical things, like there's buildings and stuff, but the stories that are associated with them are why we're able to cooperate with each other. It's actually pretty incredible.
And we like to write our own stories about our lives, right?
Yeah.
What it is we want to do. I mean, you're going to haul out Sapiens, I'll haul out Gramsci, common sense, that whole notion. Well, what is common sense? Well, it's a construct, right?
Yeah.
This is a common sense approach as opposed to not. If we didn't have stories, we didn't have things to motivate us or things to empower us or make us feel passionate, we wouldn't have anything. We'd be bland. I mean, we might be like, what's that ring on your finger, like an engineer or something, driven by math? My God, Greg, who would want that?
I know. I'm trying to get trying to massage the engineer out of me slowly over time, but it takes some work. No, I think that's interesting. I think on the how do you think, we don't have to talk a long time? COVID, I know. Hopefully, we're on the tail end of it. At least in the U.S., it had a hard start to COVID, but seems to be doing a better job on the tail end, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the Canadian situation is not great right now. But how do you see it? In the next couple of years, what do you think the effect on Canadian politics is going to be? We'll say in the medium to long term. Short term stuff will kind of move past, I'm sure. But what do you think?
Well, first there's the healing part, right? I mean, I hope we get there. We
Yeah,
will get
yeah,
there. I don't want to be pessimistic. We will get there as as we're talking today. More vaccines are getting pushed out in Canada. We're behind everybody else in the G7, but nonetheless, we're getting there. But for me, it's going to be the healing. I think, and I've spent some time in this space. It's something that matters to me. It's been a lot of mental health carnage in this time. There's been a lot of loss. There's been a lot of isolation. I think we're going to be dealing with all manner of PTSD from that for a while. And then, as you well know, from a business perspective, from an economic perspective, Jace, the money we have spent. Not that it hasn't been necessary, But we're going to have to dig ourselves out of some holes.
Yeah.
And, as we talk today, there's also talk about continuing some of the investments that have been made. Does CERB become a guaranteed annual income? That's a societal changing policy decision. So all of this stuff is not going to go away, though hopefully in another 2 or 3 months, the virus will be less intrusive in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things there. The mental health aspects are there's no doubt there'll be like some PTSD for, I think, a prolonged period of time around this, and the kind of paranoid tied to that experience. The economic impact too is something that concerns me a lot. Even if you read kind of in the US, there's a lot of optimism because there's kind of like $1 trillion in additional savings and then $2 trillion in additional stimulus. And it's like there's projections for the next 2 years to have this like overheated economy, which it sounds good in some context, but it's just like who's going to pay the bill for that, like you said. And at some point there's all, you have to, some generation or someone's going to have to foot the bill for all that stimulants. It's going to be exciting maybe for the next 18 months, but maybe when that sugar high wears off, I do worry about that.
Yeah, and the tax bills that are going to come after that, though. For home, it's really interesting because as Atlantic Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador in particular, have gotten credit, and we can debate whether they should have it or not. But anyway, for locking down and keeping people away. And does Newfoundland, does Atlantic Canada become a place now that the world looks at and says, hey, we just went through some global crisis. It was safe there. Should we do something there? Should we invest there? What, are there opportunities there? And you've seen governments like New Brunswick, you heard it in the Newfoundland and Labrador election, saying to people, come and work remotely, come and live in our places, come buy real estate. But even real estate's going up there. So, for our home province, does it create an opportunity at some point as well? Though, if you talk to people in the tourism sector at home now, they're terrified they're going to lose another summer and see lots of people unemployed.
Yeah. We actually were lucky enough to get approved to go home in December. And so we hadn't been home in 2 years and spent a couple of months there work. And we, both my wife and I work in Silicon Valley, but worked remote for a couple of months from there, which was a really nice luxury and something that, will likely stay on the West Coast for the foreseeable future. But the pandemic has really pushed all the companies to have more flexibility on being remote, and it was really nice to be able to see family and not have to, often we get home for 10 days and have to kind of rush back, and this time was different. And I hope that kind of stays like that, and I think that the flexibility for at least knowledge workers, I think, is going to be a really cool positive outcome from this time.
Yeah, and that's awesome. I'd have to say the hardest thing, look, you sounds like you're in the same boat. I'm sure many of the listeners are. We're all pretty fortunate people.
Yeah.
We have employment, we have our health, and we've had the inconveniences of the pandemic. But for me, the hardest part of the pandemic has been not being able to take my 5-year-old son home to see his grandmother in Newfoundland and Labrador, not being there for 14 months, 13 months, as I said. That's valuable time that's been lost that I'll never get back, but so be it.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't. And you just realize it's affected people in such different ways, like isolation and not being able to travel, and the actual anxiety around the pandemic, especially early on when there was so much uncertainty. It affected people in very different ways, and there was a lot of luck tied to it. If you're an airline pilot, or it just affected certain industries in such a disproportionate way. It's been really tough. Maybe I think we all have COVID fatigue. So in kind of moving on, I know you. I don't know if you own a firm or part of your firm's work is on data, and I'm curious to know. I mean, in the US, certainly you've seen a huge dialogue around data and politics. And I'm just curious to know how you think data has changed politics.
Yeah, so we own, so Summa, the firm I'm one of the main owners of owns Abacus Data, and Abacus does a lot of work in Canada, has done a little bit in the United States, certainly done some in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's not just data, as you would know from Silicon Valley, it's the application of data and what type of data you're looking to apply and you're looking to elicit. I mean, if anything in politics, it's gotten more professional. Where Silicon Valley and other places have influenced politics, it's in the micro aggregation of that data and understanding all manner of different trends that can be examined, if not predicted. And certainly, look, when I was a kid with John Crosby, a poll was the best you could get. A general election poll that gave you within 19 times out of 20 some sense of where voters were, and of course you had to rely on people telling the truth. Now, much like any other consumer marketing tool, I can find out through the data that's available what you eat, where you shop, what matters to you in your postal code. So you apply all of that in politics as you do in any other form of marketing. It changes the game. It makes it more specific, and it makes it more intrusive in a lot of ways. And I think you've lived in the U.S. You've seen that. You see that now more in Canada. Politics is become an advanced form of consumer marketing because of the data that exists.
Yeah. This is probably a topic we could talk about for hours, because I think there's complicated, and you're seeing pushback. There's even like an interesting, I think Apple's coming out with a new software update in the next couple of weeks that will kind of limit tracking ability. And you're seeing a real threat to Facebook and some of these companies that their business models kind of, based on that. But I listened to an interview with Tim Cook this week, and he talked a little bit about, it's not about even stopping tracking, but it's like letting people know, or making the choice that, that I'm okay being tracked in this way. And I think that is actually fine, as long as it's like, kind of sort of controllable or understandable. It's like this surveillance state that I think some people get the sense for. Like I was looking at blinds the other day. This is a random side story. And then like somehow I got a magazine sent to my house. A magazine sent to my house for shades. I'm like it's different when I see it online or something, but I'm like, how do they know like where I live? It was a really strange experience. And you see all kinds of things, which some people call creepy, but creepy means accurate. And it's like, it can be very effective, but it can be a little scary too sometimes, and there's some balance that I think society is trying to figure out what makes people feel comfortable and what's effective.
Well, and the whole Brexit discussion in the United Kingdom and the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how data was being used then to move people. And I mean, that's happened all through through politics and through business, of course, too. It's just now so much more sophisticated. The nice term in politics is psychographic profiling. So that will tell us, what you like to buy, where your family likes to travel, what policies probably matter to you, where you go to school. And again, if you have, this as well as I do, as do many of the listeners, you can have all that input and you can have all that data. It's how you then read it. You have to have the skill to understand what it means and discern it and apply it. And some people do it well, and others do it mischievously.
Yeah. No, I know. I can only that's where the secret sauce, I imagine, actually is like taking data, adding context, or understanding what to do with it is where the real value is, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, in Canada right now, and maybe less so in the U.S., but we have been doing at Abacus a lot of sampling, as most firms have, around pandemic, and vaccine has been a big one. And we're getting a pretty good understanding of vaccine hesitancy in Canada. So we're able to give information to people who are interested in that as to how you might try and address that. So you could argue, and I am going to with you now, that that's probably a good thing. If you can explain to people why, particularly health authorities, people are resistant to getting vaccinated, and you can help understand how you communicate to them how they communicate to those who are hesitant, maybe that helps address a useful public policy challenge, right?
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, there's no doubt that there's the utility. It's good. I think that the privacy question is just a counterbalance to it. Just that it doesn't go too far or have kind of other governments or private corporations having too much data on us. But there's no doubt there's utility and probably broader societal benefits of doing that. Just back on the topic of Newfoundland, what makes you most optimistic about Newfoundland's future? And I'll ask you the opposite side of that too, which it's probably a two-sided coin.
What makes me most optimistic? The short answer is I think there is a real sense in certain leadership places of leadership that if we don't act now, if we don't start to make some real change, we're going to be in trouble. Look, Andrew Fury, not to name drop, is a friend of mine. I think he's a good, decent, thoughtful human being. Though Chess Crosby was my cousin, so like typical Newfoundland story, you got a million fingers in the political pot there. I think Andrew Fury's heart and head is in the right place. I think he wants to do the right things. I think there's lots of people around him. I think you and I and many others who aren't in Newfoundland want to help drive the place. So it's a matter of coalescing a broad common understanding that if we don't get our shit together, we're screwed is now more pronounced than ever. And there's generational change that's happening with that, which I think is also good. So that's not entirely concise, but I think there is a moment. How about that? There's the conciseness. There's a moment now to act.
I think actually I talked to Andrew on a couple of podcasts ago, and I think I don't know if it's like a Churchill quote or something, but he's like, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Go to waste, yes.
And I think there's a sense of that now. And I think the pandemic I saw in person, like in Newfoundland, really, it kind of not missed Newfoundland, but there was a large portion where it was unaffected, because it was handled so well there. But I think the economic effects will still be felt for a long time. I think the oil impact and other things tied to the Lower Churchill will be effect for a long time to come. But anyways, I agree. There's like kind of a salient moment to do something about it. I think if I can give you my answer or something that gives me optimism, I don't think tech is like the savior. I don't know if it can't solve the whole problem. There's a lot of structural things that need to be fixed, but like working with the early stage companies and seeing the Verifin acquisition, and then seeing, there's a group of 7 or 8 companies that are in either early or kind of mid stage and startup community, and seeing the abilities and the drive and some of the ideas coming from that group of people is really impressive. And I think seeing the community coming around them to support them, and then even like Colad, this company that I'm an advisor for, they raised money from Silicon Valley. They've got, a lot of advisors from around the world, and there's like that dialogue around what's possible. And Verifin was like a big part of that, and like no one really knew what Verifin was and what it meant until they got a $2 billion check, and that all of a sudden like this, I think it really, I was at home when it happened, and I think you saw it click in people's minds that there was a couple of people that made a couple of $100 million, and it made like 100 millionaires or something to that effect. And that will have a material effect on the province, or at least, on St. John's anyways. And so hopefully to see more of that would be wonderful.
Well, you're hitting on another good theme there, right? I mean, when I was a kid, the big sort of entrepreneurial stars of the day who were always put up as beacons of hope for the province were in different spots, because that's where the opportunity was then. Harry Steele, wonderful man. Craig Dobbin, wonderful man. Those are two who leap to mind, who were, they were into construction, they were into oil, they were into communications, they were into hospitality. And they created Danny to a certain degree in cable. Dean McDonald coming after them. They were skilled, dynamic entrepreneurs who found where the opportunity was. And I think you're right. More of the opportunity on a go forward basis is with tech, and people are going there and they're popping up, and you're having those avant-garde kind of entrepreneurs now coming forward, because Newfoundland has always created a creative, talented class, an entrepreneurial class, and wherever they put their hand, I think that's of benefit to the province.
Yeah. I think the unique thing that technology, or we'll say software, has over almost basically any other industry is that you don't need to put it on a boat or a truck, right? To compete globally. And we've seen a lot of failed business ideas in Newfoundland that, tried to build something in Newfoundland and try and export. It's very difficult,
Yes.
with the exception of oil probably, and other kind of resources. But software offers that unique. You can build it there. You can have people work from other parts of Canada, around the world, and then you can ship it for free. And but I think there's two sides to that coin. It's like you can really easily compete in a global market, but the competition is fierce too, right? You're competing with Silicon Valley very directly, and China and all these other places. And so anyways, but there's a big opportunity there that there's no reason why they can't compete globally.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Honestly, that does also give me hope. I've done a little bit of stuff in that space with some Newfoundland entrepreneurs in terms of trying to give them some exposure, and I'm certainly still a sponge learning more about it, but it does give me hope.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, kind of on a different topic around climate change, you see a huge kind of global dialogue around it. There seems to be coming to a global consensus. I was talking to a friend recently about this, and the first climate summit was like in Kyoto, I think in '97, but seems like just probably in 2015 in Paris that you start to get something close to a global consensus on the topic. And I'm just curious to know how you think this is being handled in Canada, and maybe what your perspective, good, bad, or indifferent, on how things are going there.
Well, I'm glad the Supreme Court said that, and my conservative friends may not like me saying this, but I really don't give a shit. But I'm glad that the Supreme Court of Canada said that carbon pricing is a legitimate tool. Not that I'm a big fan of paying more tax myself, but I think the more important message in all of that is, as the court itself said in its decision, that climate change is a real problem. It is a threat to society. So unless you address it seriously, shame on you. Paraphrasing many, although interesting, Judge Malcolm Rowe from Newfoundland and Labrador, who's a member of the Supreme Court, he didn't disagree with that, but he said the power should be with the provinces. So he wasn't disagreeing with climate change. Other than some still silly populist political debates in Canada, I think it won't be this election, but I think by the time the next election happens, people will be fighting over who can do more to address climate change, whether it be from pricing it to creating the technology to address it. Yeah. And I think that creates opportunity, but it's real. Everything we see in our studies from our polling company shows that over 65-70% of Canadians, regardless of cohort, are of the view that it's real. It needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I think on carbon pricing specifically, it does seem not the only tool, but it seems like one of the most important ones. Until we price carbon, it's like there's nothing we can do, but we need the market to start to solve the problem. Not the problem, like the hundreds or thousands of problems that need to be solved. Yes. And I actually just finished Bill Gates' new book on climate change, and it's pretty overwhelming. I actually just left. I worked for Tesla for 4 years, and I spent 10 years with ExxonMobil. So I've seen both sides of this coin. And it's interesting. Exxon has come out very openly in support of a carbon tax, which is interesting. I think the question is around carbon taxes, like, what do you do with the revenue? And there is ways of kind of like offsetting it with other taxes, so there's no net increase in taxes. And there's some argument to what to do with the tax dollars that come from it. But even they have come out in support of a carbon tax and to create the incentive to limit, especially like excessive carbon emissions.
Well, and as you say, you can be creative in the way you deal with it. I think it's fair to say in rural Canada, which includes large parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, you're still going to be driving trucks. You're still going to be moving around simply because that's how you have to get to and fro. And you can look at redistributing the tax revenue that way to help people in those sorts of circumstances.
Yeah,
the bigger
there's
problem,
going to be a
though,
lot of things that are not non-economic effectively, right? And it's like you're going to need to be all kinds of ways to offset that, and for places that are, I will say, non-economic.
But it is managed the wrong way, and it is being managed the wrong way by some conservative politicians who are playing off the populist interest of their support. The carbon tax is described in Canada more often by the conservatives is enhancing a lot of regional discomfort in places in Western Canada and the like. And we always have different regional tensions in Canada, but again, until we move to a better place where we accept that this is a reality, those regional tensions would probably be a bit more exacerbated.
Yeah, it's such a complicated problem. I think even that book really made me appreciate how many, I worked in electric vehicles for the past 4 years, and I think I had this view that, if we electrify cars and trucks and get solar panels really good, then that would be enough to solve the problem.
No.
But man, like the transportation and even, residential energy is actually not that big of the pie. It's like a quarter maybe. And then you go into like agriculture and construction materials and manufacturing. Like it's really incredible. And that's why I think there's just so many solutions that need to come about, that I think, and you need the market incentives to be there to limit it and to come up with the solutions to mitigate it.
Most certainly. Yeah. And we're still in an evolving process around all of
that. Yeah. Okay. I was going to jump to maybe some more personal topic. I know I read your profile or kind of interview on We Persist. And I'll share a little bit of my own perspective. I've talked about it on this podcast a little bit, but I've gone through my own battles with anxiety for, I think everyone is probably going through it forever. I think I really confronted it probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it was actually very empowering for me to sort of define the problem, maybe as an engineer, once you, I remember reading the definition of general anxiety disorder, and it was like, oh shit, this is me. And oh shit, there's this big book or about how to solve the problem, or at least to learn how to start to manage it more effectively. And so that was like really empowering for me. It's not a straight line to figure out how to deal with that, but it has been through a bunch of different tools, and also just talking more openly about it. There's like a real, I think the reason, all these campaigns and stuff are like talking about it, I wasn't really sure why that was the case. I think until I went through my own journey and realizing there is like a certain shame. And I actually talked to a friend yesterday, and I don't know if it's specific to men, but I think men do tend to try and hide it and bury it. There's a real masculine aspect to being mental health, or managing your own mental health has a real stigma around it. And I think men will fight hard to hide it as hard as possible. Anyways, that's kind of my own context, but curious to know what you might want to share.
Yeah, certainly that was the case when I first discovered I was dealing like you. When I saw a definition, I'm like, oh yeah, that is me. When I discovered I had, as it was described, then major depression disorder in the mid 90s, or it would be mid 90s. And my father, now gone, also an engineer, while he was always very acceptant of me and dealing with the illness, he was of that era where he didn't understand why I was comfortable talking about it. And I've been lucky because I grew up in a house, as I said to you earlier, where you're always encouraged to speak to whatever was ailing you. When I discovered that I had this and I had great family support, I've always taken the view of not trying to hide it. I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable about it. And it's been helpful to me. And what I learned, and I'm sure you did through your journey, you quickly discover more people than not have had a very similar experience, or something that can be defined as similar. And that's so empowering, and that is so helpful. And you don't look at yourself as if you're you're atypical, you're like, okay, and you can talk to somebody about it, which makes such a big difference. And that's why I've always been more comfortable than not talking about it, and it helps me, and maybe it helps somebody else.
Yeah, I do. I think talking about it openly. I remember telling my cousin for one of the first times, and he was like, "Oh yeah, like I've dealt with this for years, and like gone through this." And I was like, and it's this weird time when you start to tell not strangers, but people who are less close to you. It feels kind of strange, but when you start to get more comfortable with it, you realize almost everyone is going through it, or something similar, or different stages in their life. If they're going through, and COVID can be an example of that's pushed to people a lot in that direction.
Well, and reading helped me a lot too. Again, I'm sure you sound you're a very well-read individual too, Greg, and not that I am, but I mean, I dove. Churchill dealt with depression. Lincoln dealt with depression. Mike Wallace, who used to host 60 Minutes. Some of the greatest artists, Lord Byron, great writer. And this was before people talked about it. And I found reading about them and the way they expressed themselves when they were going through it, the Black Dog, all of that sort of stuff, just so helpful to me and normalized it for me, so that I didn't feel I have to have anxiety about the anxiety and the depression that I had, which can be a knock-on effect.
It can't really feed on itself, right? And for me, there's a guy, Tim Ferriss, who's not quite Churchill, but he's a startup guy and podcaster kind of thing. But he, I followed him for a long time, for probably 5 or 10 years. And like, he was this hard charging, successful guy, successful writer and all these things. And then all of a sudden he started to very openly share about his depression, like dealing with depression. And I was like, holy shit. And he actually talked about it, that this is a bit of a tangent, but he talked about this thing about, he called it his, a lot of people call it their edge. Yeah. And he said he worried, and he hears a lot from especially type A people that if I kind of like take this away, like almost like this, that I'll actually lose my edge. And which is it sounds like a little perverse, like once you kind of move through some of these things. And he actually used this example of, it's like using a knife without a handle. And it's like, sure, that edge can cut, but it's cutting both ways, and it's cutting you in the process, and anyways, I think when he started to share his own story, to realize someone super successful and driven like him could basically start to actively manage his own mental health, and that it not only did he not lose his edge, but he said arguably made his life better, and gave him, he kind of compared his edge became like a surgical knife, where you can use it with much more precision and that kind of thing.
Great way of describing it. I totally understand that edge feeling, because sometimes I've felt very blessed to have dealt with it too, because it's made me change certain behaviors. It's made me look at life a bit differently. And so I've not just looked at it as a curse, but an opportunity. I don't know what it'd be like not to have it now, to be honest. So that but it ever changes.
Yeah, and that journey is never quite over. I think there's always, it's always something you need to actively manage. I see, when I looked at your Twitter feed, it seemed to be dominated by rugby. And I'd be curious. I don't know if you're currently the chairman of Rugby Canada. I'm curious to know I feel like Pat Parfrey has to be a part of that story. I don't know him, but he seems to be a legend that's tied to every Newfoundland rugby player. But curious to know why that's so important to you, and what I'm assuming that you think there's some benefit to young folks getting involved, but curious to get some context there.
Well, Pat very much is involved. He was a coach. He's still on our board. He's our world rugby rep. I consider him a mentor. He certainly encouraged me to take on the leadership role with Rugby Canada. But for me, rugby was a life-saving thing when I was going through a tough time, when I was at MUN, when I was dealing with anxiety, when I was trying to figure out the depression, when I was going through all of that. If I didn't have rugby, if I didn't have the outlet that it provided when I was there, and the experiences that it gave me, and the friendships and the networks that it built for me, I'd be a much lesser person without the sport. I firmly believe that. So, I've been on and off involved in rugby for a long time. My niece actually now is in the pathway program for one of our national teams. She got there on her own, and if she's listening, I want to confirm that she did that all on her own. So yeah, rugby for me is just a huge, it's personally validating, but it's a huge way to give back. And as Pat captured it for Newfoundland and Labrador, rugby is a sport that suits us quite perfectly, from our physical physiques to our mental disposition to our weather. It's a game for all circumstances and sizes, and so's Newfoundland. So it's
I've never heard that metaphor, but I actually like that, and I agree. I think that's intuitively on point.
Yeah, it's and as we speak today, I'm working with Pat and Chris Hickman, who you would know, and some others in Newfoundland and Labrador to bring a Rugby World Cup qualifying match to St. John's, and that'll be my retirement present to myself from the Rugby Canada chair role, if we can get that done, if COVID doesn't interrupt that. So we're working on that now.
Very cool. No, that's great. I never played myself, but had a lot of close friends that I think I was jealous of the community they had. It's like it felt like a bit of a cult, to be honest, from an outsider, but it did seem like an incredibly close community that people stayed close with for their entire lives.
Well, an engineer talking about cults is quite entertaining, but
we only have one secret ceremony. Come on.
Yeah, I don't have a ring, but I got a scar. But it's very funny. Two of my business partners in Suma come from a rugby background. A lot of the business arrangements and alignments that I have come from rugby community. Yeah, we're the skull and bones of our ilk.
All right. I think a few kind of closing questions.
Sure.
on the GlobalNL topic, either specific to us or the kind of the expat community in general. How do you think that community, either GlobalNL specifically with what you understand we're trying to do, or the expat community in general, do you think can help each other or help the province specifically?
Keep speaking up. I mean, keep talking to each other. Keep bringing people together as you're doing. You think you do a very good job of that, connecting people. Look, I find Newfoundlanders, we're very loyal people too, and I think the more we do to build our chain, if we can describe it that helps us in our private lives, but then we can give back in our broader public lives to the province and to the people who helped us. That there's nothing but good about that. There's nothing wrong with the word community, and what you're doing is helping to build an even more enhanced community. And Newfoundlanders and Labradorians live and breathe by community.
Yeah, and I think what I've realized, though, which I think was almost a point of frustration, is that when I met people, like everybody wanted to give back in some way, either some of their time, expertise, or even money. But most people don't know how, especially if you've been away for a while. It's like you kind of lose, besides family, people lose connection to the university or the business community. And so I think for us, what we're trying to do is create a bit of a conduit, to make it easy, because people are busy.
Yeah.
And but to make it easier, maybe it's a 5-minute phone call with a young student, or to have a call with a startup, or to help someone move to a new city, or whatever it might be,
And all of that matters. All of that matters. It's I'm sure it's true for you. There are lots of Newfoundlanders who gave me a hand up, and I try to do that every time I can, even the non-Newfoundlanders, Greg. That may be against our code, but I'll do that every now and then.
I know. I think the last question that I ask everybody is,
Sure.
If you could put a message on a billboard, kind of sending a metaphorical message either to the world, or sometimes I've said, if you want to put it at St. John's Airport to send kind of a message to the people of the province, but what message would you put on that board?
You know what? It's one that I think they had after the Boston Marathon bombing. And it's been copied in a lot of places, so it's not super original, but it is meaningful. That's why it's been plagiarized often, and that's stay strong. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have always been strong. They've been resilient. Our resiliency and our strength has carried us through many things. It's made us address problems. We need strength and determination more than ever, so stay strong.
I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. A special thank you to my co-host Jeremy Andrews, editor Hi Nim, and producer Frank Smythe. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to sharing more stories about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things around the world.